have to see nature-based solutions.
Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started. My name's Aaron Kramer. I'm the president and CEO of BSR, and I'm really delighted to be moderating what should be a great discussion on unlocking the potential of, look at the lights, there's the clue, blue carbon, and the blue tint for this discussion. We're going to get started in a minute. We're going to have some comments from our three wonderful panelists. We'll have some time for Q&A, but we're going to start with a video. So let's do that, and after that I'll introduce our panelists. Great. Well, that's a very visually appealing, lays a very visually appealing foundation for our discussion. So we'll dive right in, and let me introduce the panelists. I'll go from my left to right. Catherine Garrett-Cox, dressed appropriately in blue, thank you very much. The CEO of Gulf Investment Bank Asset Management, Gulf International Bank. Welcome, Catherine. We have Minister Carlos Eduardo Correa Escaf from Colombia, where he serves as the Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development. Thanks for being with us, Mr. Minister. And Professor Douglas Macaulay, who is the director of the Benioff, you might have heard that name around here this week, Ocean Initiative, and a professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And I also learned also with a bit of teaching at University of California, Berkeley, which is a 5-minute walk from my house. So that's all very nice. We're going to dive right in and lay the foundation with a few initial comments. I'll start with the minister, and then we'll do that for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll go to some questions from all of you. And let me find my way in my notes. Two-sided printing is very good, and yet. Mr. Minister, why don't we start with you? You have a well-earned reputation for promoting sustainability and helping Colombia assert leadership. Why do you see this as an important objective for your country?
Well, thank you, Aaron. Thank you, everyone. You know, in Colombia, we have two main goals. Is to be carbon neutral by 2050 and to be nature positive by 2050 too. So we are now working in making policy, not only actions, because we have to do actions, but we need policies to work on. So we updated our NDCs 1 year ago, 51% reduction the greenhouse emissions in 2030. We are working on 196 actions in our NDCs. We have now a carbon neutrality strategy by 2050, and we have a law, a climate action law. And that law puts together all our NDCs, all our carbon neutrality strategy, and now is the roadmap for Colombia in the next 30 years. So we are working in actions, we are working in policy, of course, pledges, President Duque has been here since 2020, since he's a president. He said we are going to plant 180 million trees in the framework of the 1 trillion trees. Now we have planted 123 million trees, or we are going to finish the year with 180 million trees. And those are actions, and they have to be together with public policy. So we have to achieve those goals in the next 30 years, but we are working in the short term, mid-term, and the long term. And now we have 52% of our countries covered up with forest, with tropical forest. We have more than 289,000 hectares of mangroves. We have more than 4,000 kilometers on coast. We have coral reefs. We have communities living on those areas. Colombia is the second most biodiverse country in the world, so we have a big responsibility. And now we are working in different projects. Of course, the blue economy is a priority for us. Blue carbon offsets are a priority for us, and now we are working in different projects, 6 projects related to blue carbon and mangroves. And here is Sanjay Yang from Conservation International. The first project we are working on and is certified by BERRA, it's Vida Manglar, that we are working with our partner, Conservation International. And you know, Aaron, now we have to be talking about action, the call to action, because when you're talking about carbon offsets, when you're talking about climate change, maybe the people that is here understand what we are talking about, but the communities there, they don't understand what a blue carbon is, what an offset is. So now, these kind of projects, we are working with the people. We have policy, we have actions, but we also have education, and we have work with the communities on the territory. It's the only way that that can work, all these kind of projects. So now, well, I'll be talking later about the project, but Colombia is working in a very challenging agenda for the next years, and we are doing that with our partners, different countries, private sector, financial sector that is so important, education, research, innovation, and of course, political will.
Yeah.
That we have.
Speaking of political will, how do you convey, whether it's to local communities that may not understand the concept of blue carbon, or maybe to skeptics in the government or others, how these kinds of projects deliver economic benefits for local communities and for the national economy?
That's the beautiful part of this.
That was a bit of a setup, I think. But
it's the hard part of this. You know, maybe 5 years ago, if you went to a community and said, we are going to work in carbon offsets. What? What is that? Yes, you have to conserve, you have to restore, and then in 5 years, you will receive some money for conserving and restoring. Who is going to believe that? Huh? It's not a way to believe it. So you have to get a lot of confidence with people, start working, maybe some other tools or instruments like paid for environmental services that we are working. Now we have more than 20,000 families receiving an incentive for conservation. So we started working with Conservation International, Apple at that time, and other corporations on the areas, and paying them for the conservation project on mangroves. 5 years later, now we have traded the first credits, blue carbon credits, in the international market, and now they are going to start to receiving some money for that. So in the next week, we will start the second project, and the community is so happy because now they believe. So this project in Colombia, Vida Manglar, will help not only our communities, but other countries to do this kind of projects of conservation, and of course, it's a financial project. We are working in decreasing our emissions, in capturing and carbon sequestration, but at the same time, we are working, creating new jobs, giving new opportunities, and caring and protecting nature and biodiversity. So it's the beautiful part of the project, working with people, getting confidence in the communities, and of course, we need the political will to continue, because in Colombia we have only periods, administration for 4 years. So what's going to happen next year? They have a lot of expectation about this. But we have good partners. We are working with cooperation. We have the resources. We have the policy. And we have the will from the territory.
Thank you very much. That's great. And Doug, maybe you can help almost literally ground us in some of this. We saw some of the statistics about why mangroves are so important. Tell us a little bit more. Why the focus on mangroves? What can they deliver for us?
Sure, thanks, Aaron. Well, mangroves are the super carbon-sucking ocean tree that nobody has ever heard of, save for example.
Until today.
That's
Until
right.
Today. Yeah.
And more people should hear of. So I remember a tweet Elon Musk pushed out during his $100 million carbon capture challenge and said, I'll have this prize there for any device you can come up with which can do that carbon capture fast. And some people, I think, somewhat sarcastically, but also very truthfully tweeted back, how about trees, right? Now, mangroves, as I said, are an especially good carbon capturing marine tree, and they're really good at it. So tropical forests, I think, are famously good for capturing carbon, storing carbon. Mangroves can store about 4 times the rate of carbon that a terrestrial tropical forest can, which is really impressive. When you think about the analogy of the genius of technology to the genius of nature, I think it's worth taking a beat and just unpacking that in the case of mangroves, right? So nature truly is a marvelous inventor. So a mangrove, you're seeing some beautiful images of mangroves up there. A mangrove is this solar-powered device that has these panels with micropores that absorb CO2 out of the air, shunt that down, store in the soil. It just happens conveniently that you put a layer of seawater over the top to make it enable to burn. And so you have this truly genius device that derives all this carbon out of the atmosphere and locks it away. Now, they do a lot of other good things too, and I don't want just to focus, although a lot of our focus can and should be on this great race to pull as much carbon, as much CO2 out of the atmosphere as fast as we can. There are some very significant benefits that come with that CO2. In the case, if I may, in the case of mangroves, you get that CO2, but you get, for these very communities that the minister was just mentioning, you get a lot of co-benefits. One of those is that you see these prop roots. Mangroves create this really complex matrix of roots that come down. That becomes an apartment complex for life. You'll see the fish literally in and around that apartment complex, especially young fish. It's a nursery habitat for these young fish. They then go out, become part of the populations for fisheries, feed, provide wealth, provide nutrition, provide jobs for people that live near the mangroves. They also provide this magnificent service. That complex matrix is a living break wall. They dissipate about 50% of the energy, wave energy, that comes into a coastline. And I know that quite personally. I've done a lot of work, have the privilege of working in some marvelous mangrove ecosystems. I was out in a kayak once working with my daughter, who's 5 years old, bravest 5-year-old, at least that I know. She's there with me. And as is the case in these tropical ecosystems, in comes barreling a tropical storm. We drive our kayak as fast and as deep as we can in the mangroves. It goes over the top of us. We sit there singing, "Rain, rain, go away" for 30 minutes, get soaked. Our camp gets flattened, but we're fine because the mangroves are there dissipating all that energy, protecting, in our case, my family, but most importantly, communities. So a huge amount of carbon being captured by these ecosystems, and then indeed some very important beneficial co-benefits and services, food and coastal protection.
How widely understood do you think that last point is?
Well, I don't think it's understood sufficiently. I mean, I think it's, sometimes our species can be a little bit...
Many things.
Yes.
Fill in the blank.
Fill in the blank. Cannot be, despite our intelligence, can be unintelligent. In some ways, it's like we're sitting inside a castle with a whole army coming toward us, and we're breaking walls in the castle around us, letting things in. We know, of course, storms are becoming more intense. We have cyclones, we have hurricanes. I think understanding that benefit that comes from coastal protection is key, and I don't think it's widely recognized enough. My favorite example is research before and after a super cyclone in Bangladesh. Communities behind these mangroves experience 50% less damage than communities that were exposed and lacked these mangroves. So tangible, life-saving benefits.
Well, and for a country like Bangladesh, which is on the front lines, that's super important. Thank you, Catherine. Let's go to you. Let's talk a little bit about why this is something that makes good financial sense, and why is Gulf International Bank interested in blue carbon?
Well, actually, I think investors are always interested in the business case, right? I think that that has always been at the forefront of people's minds. Having just heard Doug's impassioned plea for mangroves, I think he's just made a fantastic business case. The challenge is that it's not yet mainstream. And I mean, we've spent a lot of time this week talking about the climate crisis, the climate emergency, in fact, at Davos. And the way that we think about it is the climate crisis has many faces, and the oceans is just one of those faces, but it's often forgotten. And just to share a very stark statistic with you, at COP26, 141 countries committed over $19 billion to tackle deforestation. I bet if I asked for a sort of a rough hazard of guesses as to what the commitment was to oceans, you'd be far off the mark, because it was actually in the $20 to $30 million range. So oceans have no voice. And I think one of the things that at GIB we've been hugely passionate about is there is a really important role for the finance sector to effectively unleash the capacity that can be really played by bringing the business case for some of these topics that we're discussing together with institutional investors. So, I mean, ultimately, from our perspective, we have been proud members of Friends of Ocean Action for some years now. And I think really our whole approach is about partnership. We've already heard this, and the Minister already talked about the fact that you've got to connect policymakers with communities, with investors. So why hasn't this worked to date? And I think one of the challenges has been, and we saw this on some of the stats in the video that ran very early on, some of these things just take a long time to develop. So the time lag between project funding and return is simply very long. The second key challenge is that this is a very misunderstood and underdeveloped market. So the demand is increasing, but the supply just isn't there. And so for some of these blue carbon projects, such as they are, many of them are being developed by communities on the ground. They're just not scalable when you look at the scale of money that can go into them. So from a GIB perspective, what are we specifically doing about it? Because I think Davos is full of great conversations and intent, but we've got to follow it up with action. So from our perspective, we've been working with Friends of Ocean Action in developing the Blue Carbon Market Principles, which will be published in COP27, which will really set the framework around how we actually sort of set up these projects that will really matter. The second very practical thing we've been doing, and we've already heard reference to this, is we've been partnering with Uplink and been involved in the Blue Carbon Challenge, which specifically looks at finding both innovators who are designing solutions on the ground, because we've got to find solutions for unlocking this, as well as increasing the education. I have to say, in the 15 years that I've been coming to Davos, I don't think I've ever seen so much on the program as this year about oceans. So perhaps this is finally the year when oceans get a voice.
Yeah. Very well said about oceans not having a voice and needing one. Tell us a little more about the blue carbon market principles. What do they involve, and what do you think they'll catalyze?
Well, I mean, they're still very much in development, but I think part of the reason for having principles is you've got to have guardrails. You know, what makes a blue carbon project? How do you then verify it? I mean, again, this is a market that is still developing. And I think one of the things that has become very clear when you're talking about sustainability in all forms, whether it's blue or green or some combination thereof, is you've got to connect the ability to both sort of measure and capture what these projects look like, what they need, and how do you determine that they've actually been successful. So again, work in progress, but I think the fact that some of these principles are starting to get more airtime and crowding in people that can actually make a difference, because it isn't just about having policymakers in the room or business people. And the reality is business people have probably been a little bit late to the party. So, you know, my call to arms is really, if you care about this topic and you are CEO of a public company or a private company that cares, just reach out and engage, because it is only going to be the case that many, many people can really lift awareness. And we've got to protect the oceans. I mean, it matters, right? My husband and I have a tiny little holiday home on a remote Scottish island. And one of the things that just totally stresses us out is from our window, we can look out and see ships dredging on the horizon. And the damage that they cause, just to give you some idea, a wonderful friend of mine, Enric Sala, who runs the Pristine Seas project for Nat Geo, he has estimated that fishing nets that drag sediment from the sea bottom effectively emit 1.5 billion tons of carbon, which is more than the entire aviation sector alone. So this matters. So if you care, step up.
That's a very compelling statistic, and it's a very troubling statistic, but it's important to have it in mind. Mr. Minister, have other governments taken notice of what Colombia is doing? There's a lot of, you have a lot of coastline, but there's a lot more coastline beyond the borders of Colombia. What do you see happening elsewhere?
Aaron, you have to come to Colombia and see the beautiful view.
I told you, my daughter's there at the moment.
You know, we are working together with other colleagues, other ministers, other countries. I think climate made us work together. And we have never worked before. Maybe when you're talking about borders, you're thinking about protecting and, you know, maybe a national defense thing. But we are talking about climate. It's different. So now we are working on that corridor on the Pacific Ocean with Ecuador, Colombia, from Galapagos, Malpelo, and Yurupari in Colombia, Isla del Coco in Costa Rica, Coiba in Panama. And you know, to see in COP26, the 4 presidents talking about protecting the biggest corridor ever in the world, it was amazing. So we are working together. Now we are working with Dominican Republic. We are working in another corridor on the Atlantic Ocean. And we are part of the High Ambition Coalition and the Leaders Pledge for Nature. Our commitment is to protect the 30% of our territory in 2030. But President Duque made an announcement in COP26, and it was that we are doing that 8 years before. So in July, we'll be declaring the 30% of our territory, ocean and continental area, as a protected area. Now we have 15%. We are going to double in only 8 months. So we are working together in the High Ambition Coalition. We are working more than 20 countries working in this. And what we want is, to make a call to action. No more pledges. We need to act now. And that's why we are working so hard to do this 8 years before. So we are working in the 30 by 30. We are working with the colleagues, our countries, not only in oceans, but in biodiversity, in carbon offsets. And I think all the ministers and the presidents are realizing now that the climate change is a reality, and it's not only a romantic conversation. It's competitivity, and of course, it's the only way to preserve human beings here in the planet. So we are working a lot. I think this corridor on the Pacific Ocean is going to be an example for other countries to work on that. And finally, Aaron, we had a hurricane. You were talking about hurricanes now, about cyclones, and we had a hurricane in 2020 in San Andres y Providencia. We never had a hurricane before, a number 5 category. And the next day we got there with the president, and I was, you can imagine, the island was devastated. I said to my team, how are we going to recover this? But nature, it's beautiful. Just when it starts raining, the plants start growing. When we went to the ocean and see 80% of the mangroves were affected. And more than 50% of the coral reefs were affected. So we started this project. We're now planting 1 million corals with our partner. Sanyang is here. We are working on blue economy together, and we're planting 1 million corals with the communities, paying them for environmental services, working with the fishermen associations. Now we have planted already 300,000 in those areas. And we have the mangrove nurseries to start restoring all those areas. And of course, after that, we are going to certify those projects with blue carbon credits. So we have to protect, we have to restore, we have to conserve, and then it will come the resource, the income for the communities.
Let me build on that, and a question for both Doug and Catherine, then I'm going to turn to the audience. So income for the communities, crucial point. So Doug, in your research, with or without your 5-year-old daughter, and Catherine, from where you sit, how can we make sure that local communities both understand and then capitalize on the economic opportunities of these investments?
I can share a first thought, which is that we don't have to let the communities, we don't have to teach them to understand, they understand. It's really the other way around, that we need to learn from the communities. Such an immense amount of deep wisdom in these communities that already know how much value they can take from nature. And they use different language and terminology, quantify things in different ways that are equally valid, but they understand. The grand challenge, I think, is actually taking that value that they get and giving them value for those values, reinvesting in the services that these systems are giving back. So we're off to a good start, because I think we're on the same page with communities that understand that nature, we are part of nature. We need nature healthy to have healthy communities, and to ourselves be healthy in these settings. So we're advantaged in that way. And I should say too, we're talking about the different players here. To make blue carbon work, we need everyone in the room, everyone in the panel. That's scientists to get really good measures of this carbon. That's policymakers to implement, to set visions, more importantly, to achieve vision. That's business stepping up, making investments, adding rigor to those investments. And that's all part of the ecosystem, but we're missing a key piece in this conversation, which is those communities. We can have all of the ingredients in the recipe we're talking about, but we can't bake a thing until we include that last missing ingredient, community. So I'm glad you brought that up, Erin, because that is absolutely essential for success.
Catherine?
I mean, just building on Doug's comments, it's such an important part of the equation. And I think that the reality is that the communities see it because they live and breathe it. I mean, it's around them every day. And I think there are some really good examples of projects that have grown up with a sense of community involvement. I mean, we've already talked about the benefits of things like tourism, but I mean, another big topic of the meeting this year has been resilience. And actually, it is beholden upon us to work with communities to create more resilience. Because if we've learned anything about the impact of climate change, it is the poorest communities that suffer the most. So there's a really good example, actually, of a project in Bangladesh called Friendship Bangladesh, which basically engaged coastal communities in protecting mangroves. And as a direct result, they saw a 63% increase in incomes, and most importantly, the creation of 75 women-led forest protection sort of organization groups, specifically for mangroves. So you have jobs, you have tourism, and you create better resilience. So I think, it can be a win-win-win, but I think to Doug's point, how do we make sure that communities are also part of this conversation?
There's been a lot of talk this week, for good reason, about inflation, about potential looming recession. These are cyclical shocks to the economy. As we talk about the macroeconomic situation, it's been a little alarming to me that no one is talking about how climate is undermining our economy, and it will only continue to do that. So we have to not just focus on what's happening today, but think about underlying changes that also really do undermine economic vitality and shared prosperity. I'm going to turn to the audience. I'm going to start with Christy Borelli, who is a lawyer, clerk to the Justice of the Supreme Court of the island nation of Trinidad and Tobago, who's done a lot of work in this area. So, Christy, why don't you start us off, and then we'll see who else wants to ask a question.
All right, thank you for that, Mr. Kramer. I'm Christy Borelli. I am representing the Port of Spain hub in the Global Shapers community delegation. And as a global shaper, the connection between globally urgent projects and in local communities is really important to me. And I'm really pleased to hear how much emphasis is being placed on meeting the needs and priorities of these communities, as well as, treating the communities as knowledge holders in this area. It seems to me that a key determinant of preservation of this kind of ecosystem would be the quality of relationship that exists between nature and the human communities that live near or within them, whether it could be harmonious or exploitative, asynchronous even. I'm wondering, can these communities that live closely with nature in balance, can they be a bridge? Can we start to look at reconnecting with nature as a form of development and activism?
It's a great question. Who'd like to take it up?
Well, that's a very interesting question. This is all about nature and people. How to connect nature and people. How to get to be nature positive in the next 30 years. I'm gonna answer you with an example. We are planting 1 billion corals in San Andres. We are working with more than 400 families in the restoration of 200 hectares of corals. And now, with a university, a public university, we are certifying those 400 families in restoration. And what we want to do is that in the next couple of months, we're going to start sending these people with their certificates to Mexico, to Dominican Republic, to all the Caribbean islands, to start helping them to restore. So all the knowledge is going to be in other countries where, you know, someone said this morning in a panel that, and you said now that people don't know, but they don't want that a scientist tell them anything, or a politician, or they want to talk to each other. So if these people from San Andres, Providencia, and Santa Catalina goes to República Dominicana or to Mexico, they're going to talk to each other about nature and people. So I think this is one of the most beautiful programs we have. We're talking about conserving, restoration, we are talking about people with education. And we need to scale up these kind of projects, not only to Central America or the Caribbean, but we have to scale up to another continents and start, you know, teaching people, make them feel about the profitability of restoration and conservation. Yeah.
And can I just perhaps just kind of build on that, you know, around the whole education piece, because it's so important. And it's interesting to me, and slightly perverse, that we've spent the last 2 years freaking out about health, about, you know, human health, and whether we can get through this crisis safely. We've sort of put nature's health rather on the back burner. And so what conditions are placed upon us? What's our responsibility as a generation who see the problem, believe we can start to do something about it? But I think it really falls on your generation and the generation of our children to really pick up the baton. And it's how do you present them with opportunities to actually see things up close, to see the beautiful preciousness of nature, to see things when things go wrong. Because that's ultimately how you create that lasting change. And as we heard at lunch, you know, this is an intergenerational responsibility, and we can't walk out of this room thinking it's someone else's problem.
Well said. Got one question here, and then I think I see one in the back and one over here. So be as brief as you can so we can get as many questions as possible, and please introduce yourself.
Well, thank you. My name is Barry Martin. I'm a board member of Rabobank. As you may know, really our goal as Rabobank is feeding the world sustainably. And I will be very honest to you, I have no clue about blue carbon. So I'm very happy for this, this panel here. Two things that I would like to ask you. The first thing is, we are big pushers of the true value of food, right? So pricing all externalities in producing food. So also the environmental externalities. So if I go to boards now of big fish companies, and let me go that way, right? If you're talking about feeding the world, they're all struggling with how do we going to produce net positive fish? I should not say produce, this is not right, sorry. How are we going to actually supply the world with net positive fish? And to me, if I see, we have not talked about that, we talked about the communities, but linking those things seems to me so logical. So my question really is, how are we going to get, and I will call them big fish, sorry, into connection with this? Because that seems to be the only way that we can produce when we need to feed the world. We know the food crisis. This is a way, in my view, how we could actually have the production or the feeding of net zero positive fish.
So food systems, and particularly fish. Who would like to take this on?
Well, I can take on the literal fish piece, but the bringing big fish in that are going to need to be partners for this, I'll leave to colleagues. But I think you're very right, even if approaching blue carbon for the first time, to understand that there's a nutrition connection. So talked about mangroves, but the same is true, I should say, for tidal marshlands. The same is true for seagrasses, which are other important living blue carbon assets. They're very often nursery habitats for fish. I said that before, but what probably many people know, but I want to underline again, is that fish are like a super vitamin for many communities. And for many communities that are suffering from diseases associated with malnutrition, especially kids, access to fish is vitally important. So with preservation of some of these blue carbon ecosystems, you get this win-win, right? You get the capture of the carbon. Well, there are other wins we talked about. You get the shoreline protection, but you get this provisioning of nutrition close to home to these communities. And it's just so important. And it's just so important for fighting the climate fight, dealing with vulnerability, but very, very importantly, dealing with this catastrophe of malnutrition that's unfolding in some of the same places, often co-located where these blue carbon assets are. Just a quick note of risk. Why we all in this room have our work cut out for us is that about 20 to 30% of mangroves, will choose one of those blue carbon ecosystems, have been lost in the last 50 years. Lots of drivers of loss. One of those is loss and conversion of mangroves to aquaculture production. But when you think aquaculture, you think food, but in fact here, this is aquaculture for export. Most often it's shrimp that's not being kept in these communities, not being eaten in these communities, being exported. So there's a real need to think about, okay, how can we deal with looking after these systems because they create those food benefits and not undoing the win-win with getting a loss-loss. There are those double, triple losses in front of us if we go down the wrong pathway.
Aaron, one minute.
Because I want to get two more questions.
Two things.
So.
The trawling fishery is equivalent to deforestation in the forest. Mm-hmm. So that concept about net zero fishing, I love it. We have to be working about that. And the other one is, with the same example, all the communities that are restoring corals and mangroves now in San Andres, all those fishermen, when they go underwater, they are seeing that the fishes are coming back. So now they understand the value of protecting, conserving, and of course, the blue carbon will be there.
I'm going to take two questions together. So one here, and then I think we've got one there. So again, be as quick as you can.
Hi, Richard.
Hello.
Quick one. Why have you not talked at all about connecting with consumers? So if I'm a consumer in the grocery store, how do I know this is a good one from Colombia and this is a bad one from somewhere else?
And before you answer, a great question. Thank you, Richard. Let's get this question in.
I'm Darsono from Indonesia. Congratulations on the first mangrove deal verified. I'm in the MBS business as well. My question is, you got a very high price on your carbon, right? Is it because Apple willing to pay, or you think that mangrove deserve to get paid more? Because, I mean, we'll talk about mangrove, they are peatland, they're tropical, they all have their benefit. Community, biodiversity, resilient, adaptation, whatever you want. I just want to know, do you think it's a mangrove thing, or is it an apple thing? So.
It's a mangrove thing. I have to be brief. So,
go for it.
And I give you the word. It's a mango thing, because the second credits that we sold, that we trade, were sold at the triple price of Apple, and we are talking about $30 to $40, and in the next 2 years we'll be talking about $100, $150. So it's a mangrove thing.
Okay, anyone want to take either one of the two questions?
Well, I'll just say it's going to be really important to connect this conversation through investors and out into consumers, only because, and maybe others can add, but there are absolutely, the only point I'll make, there are right ways and wrong ways. There are good projects and bad projects, even in this blue carbon space. So there are lots of projects which, for example, will plant hundreds, thousands of mangroves, and then you come back in a year because they're not planted with the right methods, with the right care, the right amount of community stewardship and involvement, they die, and that investment is lost. So there are pitfalls in this blue carbon space. Now, exactly, maybe I'll leave Catherine and others to say the best ways to get that message in and out to consumers, because it's vitally important.
Catherine, you?
I mean, I think what I would add, Richard, is that I think the consumers are an important part of the conversation, And I think actually in a post-COVID world, this is just going to be easier, because some of these topics absolutely got elevated during people's time locked up at home. I don't know about you, but we spent a lot of time peering at labels and working out how did we ensure that we were eating organic food that hadn't traveled very far. And I think those topics are just going to be higher up consumers' agendas, absolutely.
Great, so speed round to finish out the discussion, about 10, 15 seconds each. What would you most like to see happen in the next year to have us come back, whether it's May or January in 2023, feeling like blue carbon has really advanced?
Am I going to go first?
Go first.
Okay. I would say my greatest hope is that we crowd more business leaders into this space who really care about financing the solutions, because ultimately, as I see it, a blue future is a new future.
Right.
Well, I need to see in the next years private, public, and education working together in research, in innovation, and in education about these kind of projects, about blue carbon, and that is the only way to scale up these projects.
Thank you. Doug.
Two quick ones. One, underlining Catherine's point, amazing to see companies like Salesforce, Netflix on this journey, bringing others in to set up these principles. I want to see those principles established fast, and used even faster. Second point, I love mangroves, but I want to use my airtime to underline one important thing. Mangroves, blue carbon is step 2. Remember, please remember, step 1 is reducing emissions, avoiding emissions before you can proceed to step 2.
That is excellent. Thank you for the three of you. Great insights on a really important issue, and I'm delighted that this is on the Davos agenda. So let's bring back some successes in a year. Thank you all very much.